Hi, I'm Dominic and I'm going to show you how to make 3 different types of St Bridgid's cross. Starting with the traditional cross, you take a rush, take a second rush and fold it over the first one. Then take the next rush and fold it over the last one. You add it, then turn it around and keep adding rushes until the cross is the size that you want it. These cut rushes used to be used as a floor covering in old Irish dwellings, and the story about the first Bridgid cross made by St Bridgid herself is that she was tending a chieftain on his deathbed and she was telling him the story of the Passion of Christ, and she lifted rushes up off the floor and began to weave a cross just like this to explain the story to the dying man, and she baptised him before he passed away. She was born in a small village outside of Dundalk in County Louth around 450 AD. Her mother was a slave and her father was a chieftain by the name of Duach, which would be Duffy. Her mother was sold to a druid in Connacht shortly after Bridget was born, so she was reared by a foster mother. And from a very young age, she was known for her charity, always giving food to the poor, giving away her possessions, and she had a great affinity with nature and with animals. One story tells of how she saved the life of a slave who had accidentally killed the King of Leinster's pet fox. So Bridget tamed a similar wild fox and replaced the king's beloved pet, and he never knew the truth of what actually had happened. Bridget's charitable nature met with her father's disapproval, and at about the age of 12 his patience had run out and he took her before the King of Leinster with the intention of selling her as a slave. And while she waited outside the King of Leinster's fort, she saw a leper in the streets begging for food. So she took her father's bejewelled sword from the chariot and gave it to the leper so that he could barter it for food. When her father discovered this, he was enraged even further and brought her before the king and made explain her actions. And the king, who was a Christian himself, told Duach to leave her alone and that she was more worthy in God's eyes than either of they were. So when they returned back to Louth, Duach granted Bridget her freedom, and she requested that she could go and see her mother. He refused. Bridget went anyway, and she worked alongside her mother, looking after cattle and working at a dairy for the druid. And one day the druid and his wife made a surprise visit to the dairy and were astounded by the amount of produce that had been created and the quality of it. Apparently Bridget was renowned for her dairy work, hence the reason she's also the patron saint of dairies and of farmers. And the druid offered her his herd of cattle, which would have been considered a very prestigious gift at the time, but Bridget asked instead for her mother's freedom and got it. So she and her mother returned to Louth, and Bridget was around 16 at this stage, and her father wanted to arrange a marriage for her to the King of Ulster. So Bridget prayed to God to make her appearance so ugly that no man would want to look at her. Apparently her prayers were answered, and she got out of the marriage and decided she wanted to go off on a religious life. And at this point she and 7 other young girls from the chieftain's fort left for Kildare, where of course St Bridgid founded her monastery, and she and these 7 girls were the first community of religious women in Ireland, the first nuns in other words. And St Conleth ran a monk's monastery alongside Bridget's convent. And there's a lovely story about how she acquired the land to build the monastery. She approached the landowner asking him to donate land, and he sarcastically told her that whatever amount of ground that her cloak would cover, she could have. So St Bridgid took off her cloak, laid it on the ground, and the cloak began to increase in size and kept increasing until it had covered an acreage of ground that she required for her monastery. The landlord, in absolute astonishment at what he had witnessed, kept his word and gave her the land. This land had a large oak tree on it, which provided shelter for the site, and Bridget built a beehive-like hut underneath this oak tree, as the other nuns would have built similar huts. These huts consisted of sticks stuck into the ground in a circular formation, and they were thatched with rushes like these. The twigs were tied at the top, forming, I suppose, a kind of a cone-shaped structure, and the walls were then woven with rushes, grasses, and mud from the River Liffey was used to waterproof it. And of course rushes like these would have been used for the flooring, and the door was just a gap in the twigs. And this is where we get the name for Kildare, because the hut that she lived in, or the cell, which is kill in Irish, kill, and dara being oak, so Kildara, the cell of the oak, or the church of the oak. She also established a school of arts and crafts, and particularly metalsmithing and illumination of literature. And there's a book, the Book of Kildare was created here, and it was described by a monk, a visiting monk from Wales, Gerald of Wales, as angelic and not of human hands. The Book of Kildare is thought to rival the Book of Kells in beauty, but unfortunately it has been lost to history, though some historians argue that the Book of Kildare and the Book of Kells may indeed be the same book. But whatever the case, it gives us an idea of the standard of the work produced at the School of Art in Kildare that St Bridgid had founded. She is, of course, patron saint of poets, farmers, dairies, as I said, arts and crafts, metalsmithing, particularly blacksmithing. So that's the first cross. All that remains now is to cut these ends. I'm going to, traditionally it would have been bound with another piece of rush, but I'm going to use elastic bands as it's easier. So I use, where are my scissors? I use these small scissors as a measurement. Got that there. Elastic band. Interestingly, St Bridgid passed away on the 1st of February 525 AD, and of course the 1st of February is her feast day. And she was buried beside the altar in the cathedral in Kildare, and a shrine, a bejewelled shrine, was erected with crowns of gold and silver. And in 878 the Viking raids began. So for fear of her remains being disturbed, St Bridget's remains were moved to Downpatrick where she was interred with the remains of St Patrick and St Columkill. But the story doesn't end there. For some reason that nobody seems to know, St Bridgid's skull was taken by 3 knights during the Crusades. So this was around 12 to 1300 AD. And they brought St Bridgid's skull to Lumiar, which is outside of Lisbon in Portugal. And her skull remains there to this day in the chapel of St John the Baptist. And the 3 knights who transported her skull remained guarding it until the day that they died, and they are also interred in the same church. So that's the traditional St Bridget's cross. The second cross is a 3-legged version, thought to be pagan in origin, and is very similar to the first cross, only this time we're just using 3 instead of 4 legs. So I'll start it off like this, done in the same way, bend a rush over the previous, and you keep on round until you have it the size that you want. And this one was placed in cattle sheds, and it was believed to protect the animals on the farm, particularly from fire, just like the cross that was placed in the house. And it was also thought to bring good luck. And that brings me to the pagan goddess Bridgid, who was a member of the Two-Headed Danann. And the Two-Headed Danann were a magical race of people who ruled in Ireland approximately 4,000 years ago. And the myth goes that they were banished from heaven because of their knowledge, and they descended upon Ireland in a cloud of mist, and they were attributed as being shapeshifters. They could take the form of any human being or even animal. And Bridgid was described as being adored by poets and a great source of inspiration. And it was thought that she had 2 sisters, Bridgid the Healer and Bridgid the Smith, which suggests that she was a triple deity, meaning 3 goddesses worshipped as one. Her feast day, or she was celebrated on the 1st of February, as she was considered the goddess of the spring, and that was known as the pagan feast of Imbolc. Many of her attributes are similar to that of St Bridgid, and the 2 women have, well, one fictional and one real. They have a lot in common, and I suppose over time the stories of the 2 of them have become synchronized into one. So as you can see, this cross is starting to take shape. Similar, only 3 legs this time. I'm going to continue this. And the Two-Headed Danann, the intriguing part of their story is that they disappeared from view when the Milesians arrived in Ireland, and the Milesians are our modern day Irish ancestors. They were Gaels that came from Iberia and settled in Ireland, and the Dananns disappeared from view, but they never left. The story goes that they live between the underworld and the real world. Another story says that they live in the spirits of trees, in our lakes and rivers and mountains, and even in the winds that blow on our shores. And this is what gave rise to the stories about fairies, because many people believe that the fairies are in fact the Two-Headed Danann. Another belief is that they still walk among us, but that they are cloaked from our vision by their magic. Almost here with this one. And the interesting thing about the first cross is that people for centuries in Ireland, when they made their cross each year on St Bridgid's Eve, the cross was placed in the rafters of the house, and you could tell the age of a home by counting the number of crosses that they had stored in the rafters, because they didn't, unlike today where we make one this year and then it gets thrown out when it's replaced with next year's. They just placed year after year a new cross in the rafters. And again, I'm just going to use this as a measurement. And tie off the ends. So I'm unraveling on me here. So this particular cross is going to my cousin's farm to protect his cattle. This is the third cross, and I'm going to make up 10 bundles, each consisting of 4 rushes. So just secure it with a band at one end. I have a bundle here already, so use that as a measurement guide. And secure it at the other end. Once you have your 10 bundles, we'll start to weave the cross together. Split them into 2 groups of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5. So I don't know the origin of this cross, and it's just, I suppose it's a fancier version than the straightforward traditional cross. So take a bundle of 5 and secure with a band, and spread them out into like a fan. And this is, I suppose, basic weaving. So I take one of my other bundles and I'm going to go under, then over, then under, then over, and then under. So that's the first one down. As you can see, it's like weaving cloth. So for the next one, I'm going to start by going over and then under. So over that one, under that one, over that one, under that one, and over that one. That's number 2. Push them down. So for the next, we reverse it again. This time we go under, over, under, over, and under. Now for the next one, I'll just move these down. So the next one, how do we start with under? Yeah, so it's over, over, under, over, under, over. That brings us to the last one. This will make sense in a minute. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this time we're starting, we went over there, so we go under, over, under, over, and the last one's an under. Okay, Now we're starting to bring it together. I'm going to take these 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 and bring these together. Tie a band on it until I get it straightened up. And for these, try and keep them the same length. And there you have it. The other tradition that was more commonplace, I suppose, in times gone by than it is now was the St Bridgid. And that was to do with St Bridgid's cloak, and I told you the story of the cloak. And the tradition is that you leave out a piece of flannel or a piece of cloth. Here's my piece of cloth, it's just a piece of white felt, can be any colour. You leave your piece of cloth outside overnight to be blessed by St Bridgid on St Bridgid's Eve. And the cloth was taken into the house the following day. In some cases it was kept as a healing cloth for whenever illness struck. And in other cases, as was the tradition in our house, we would cut up the piece of cloth so that each family member had a piece that they wore on their person to bring them protection throughout the year. So that concludes the crosses and the stories of St Bridgid and the pagan goddess Bridgid. So Bannacht na Fela Bridgid Eve, St Bridgid's Day blessing to you, Slán agus Bannacht.